I am Gretchen Dolson. I'm the Renewable Energy Director for HDR Engineering. So Rob has done a terrific job of taking the last hour and taking you through some of the future trends and how renewables is going to fit within that larger, what I'll say is a societal transformation. How does renewables fit? Now, this panel is going to talk a little bit more from their individual perspectives and what that means for them as businesses, what that means for us as residents in Nebraska. Being someone who lives here, I have a pretty tight connection to seeing the renewable program proceed in the state. I'm pretty passionate about it myself, in spite of the fact that I work globally. And so do these individuals. So let me introduce you to our panelists now. Jeff Clark. Jeff is with the Wind Coalition. I'm going to give each of them a minute or two to talk about themselves. Jeff is with the Wind Coalition. Sylvia Bartell, she is with Husch Blackwell and is an attorney in this space. And then Justin Pickar. Am I saying it right? You got it. Oh man, I guessed correct. He works for one of the developers that does a tremendous amount of work here in the state. So all of these individuals work with Nebraskans. They're familiar with our state and how we do business. They work with the utilities, but between the engineering, the legal, the developer, and the policy side, that's kind of the representation of this panel. So feel free to direct some of those questions to folks as you have them. I have some set questions set up. I'm going to try to take us through and talk on a national policy and then kind of focus that down into Nebraska specific. We are going to touch a little bit on the electrification and EV and kind of our perspectives from that space, and then also the regulatory environment and maybe some of the things that we don't necessarily talk about as an industry. So Jeff, would you take a moment and introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning. And Rob was a tough act to follow. I'll say that. That's one of those presentations that I'm probably going to go back and watch 2 or 3 times on the video just to see if I can catch it all. But my name is Jeff Clark. I run the Wind Coalition, which is an organization that was set up about 15 years ago to lobby for landowners and project developers and the companies that manufacture wind equipment to help wind get established in the United States. And we've had tremendous success thanks to places like Nebraska. We focus on the Southwest Power Pool and ERCOT, so I like to say I've got the best wind in the world from Mexico to Canada, right up through the middle of the country. We have that beautiful purple stripe of wind energy. And we've diversified recently as an organization to become the Advanced Power Alliance. We're in the process of changing our name and expanding our work into solar and storage, which we'll talk more about. But we've seen over the 6 years that I've been here, an industry that went from we're doing wind, we'll never do solar, to we're doing wind and we're doing solar and we're doing storage and we're doing whatever advanced technology is next. And so it's a pretty exciting time, and thanks again for having me.
Justin, how about you?
I'm Justin Pickar. I work with Geronimo Energy. I'm Senior Director of Origination. I'm everything sales. I work with many of you in the crowd. And I've been coming to this conference for 9 years straight. We are a Upper Midwest rooted developer, now owner. And if you take a look at the country between New York State and all the way down over to Washington State, that's kind of our geography. And all the way down from right up the gut of the country, all the way from North Dakota, South Dakota, all the way down to Texas. So we have a very large geography. I'm number 4 in the company. We've got about 100 employees to date. We've grown over time. The biggest growth area that we see right now is the owner-operating side of our firm. That's in the last 3 years, we've now become to own and operate assets, which has really blown our company up as far as people and operations. The two pillars of our company, thanks whoever is running the show here, thank you. The 2 pillars that we're proud of is, one, farmer friendly. And what does that mean? We were founded by a farmer in southwest Minnesota. It's deeply rooted into the fabric of how we develop projects in the upper Midwest and beyond. But it's a big part of our philosophy, our development philosophy. And so if any of you have questions about farmer friendly, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. There's not too many people in the industry that have projects in their backyards. And I'm happy to tell you, in 2016, a project I originated in 2007 went online in my hometown. So it's a 200 megawatt wind farm in North Dakota. The second thing is financial savviness. So there's not one or two ways to get things done. We have had a lot of success through the years of thinking outside the box, thinking creatively, and getting things done. Be happy to talk to you after this session about that as well. Next slide, please.
Oops.
There's no more slides. So I'm going to pause
There it is.
and hand it over to
There it is.
Sylvia. Oh, okay. So a couple of the updates, what's new at Geronimo. As I mentioned earlier, we're now a full life cycle developer owner. Some of the figures, we currently under construction, we are managing that process, 415 megawatts of projects currently under construction. It's a big, big deal for us. And 154 megawatts of wind and solar currently owned and operated. Totally a new business side of the business for us. And we're looking to acquire, but also many of the projects that we greenfield will have an opportunity to be a part of our infrastructure fund that we've developed. Corporate, we'll talk a little bit about corporate PPAs. That's a big deal for us as well. The last 3 power purchase agreements were virtually settled, and the last 3 deals were big deals with corporates. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. REC contracts, 2 of the parties, IPA and NYSERDA, we have 240 megawatts worth of REC contracts that we've been awarded and we're trying to find homes for. So if you have any leads in the Illinois area, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. And then community solar, we're one of the leaders in community solar around the country. We currently have developed over 150 to 200 megawatts of community solar, working with, in the range of 1 to 2 megawatts. And we have a full service offering in regards to acquisition, management, billing, and also subscriptions. So we can kind of do the one-stop shop for communities. Anyway, I'm going to hand it over to Sylvia.
Good morning. Thank you to Gretchen and my fellow panelists, and of course to the Wind and Solar Conference here in Nebraska. I'm really thrilled to be speaking to you today. I'm a Nebraska native, but I'm currently based out in DC, doing federal energy law and also state regulatory law. Specifically, I focus on issues involving the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as well as state public utility commissions, and that takes place both on the transactional side as well as on the litigation side. So I work out of DC, but also I do quite a bit of work here in our Omaha office. I work for Husch Blackwell, which is a national law firm, and in that firm I work in the energy and natural resources practice group. So I look forward to speaking with the panelists and hopefully answering some good questions from all of you in the audience.
So let's jump right in with that first question. Let's talk macro scale for a minute, if we could. And what are some of the things that from each of your perspectives that you're really seeing that are impacting how you are participating in the various regions? Most in this audience are probably going to be aware that Nebraska is in the Southwest Power Pool. There are many, that is called a regional transmission organization or an RTO. There are multiple RTOs throughout the nation. And in that macro scale, what are some of the big trends that you're seeing that impact what is going on? Justin, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. We're in PJM. We have projects in PJM, which is the eastern, northeast part of the country, kind of eastern side of the country. SPP, Jeff will talk about SPP quite a bit. It's right up the gut, right between all the way down to New Mexico, Texas, all the way up to the Dakotas. And then you have MISO and of course CAISO, and then the unorganized market, which is kind of in the call it West region or WEC. It's a logjam right now in regards to the queue. Couple figures that recently were shared at a MISO meeting was PJM 70 gigawatts of projects trying to get through the application process and to the queue process right now. SPP, very similar, 80 gigawatts of projects trying to get through the queue, and MISO was 90 gigawatts. So those are 3 big numbers. I think those folks are working hard. trying to vet which projects are real, but it's really pushing back from a developer standpoint, it's pushing back that developer start date to construction and COD date. It's pushing everything back, makes it much more difficult to really fully develop the asset, financeability. It impacts the entire process.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in that space, and when we have these log jams occurring, a lot of times that is the transmission and the transmission piece, and is there capacity on those transmission lines to handle that? Sylvia, do you want to talk a little bit about either some of the Department of Energy work or some of the things that are going on in that transmission side?
Absolutely, and I think that at the macro level, it's really important to talk about transmission. Of course, you mentioned all the various RTOs in the nation and unorganized markets as well, but recently the DOE issued a notice of procedures informing the public that they are conducting their triennial study of congestion on the transmission system. And they're doing that, it's required by federal law. The Federal Power Act requires DOE to conduct these congestion studies. The point of it is to identify congested areas on the grid and to identify corridors for transmission development called natural interest electric transmission corridors. The DOE has done this in the past, but there's been a lot of, it's really been stalled by the federal courts because they found that the corridors were far too broad and that they were impeding on state authority to site transmission. So now the DOE is at it again. Hopefully they've indicated that they are going to, one thing they're considering is narrowing the corridor, identifying very localized areas that are needed, local areas to construct transmission that might even be as local as project specific or clusters of projects. So we have really high hopes for this triennial, the currently pending triennial study, to hopefully alleviate some congestion on the grid. And so what does that mean for a project developer? One of the things that I know certainly several of our clients face in the project development stage is interconnection upgrades, costs that are incurred to build out the transmission grid to accommodate your interconnected project. Those costs can be, if you're lucky, around $300,000. We've seen costs up to $50 million. That's generally when you get into a litigation situation if you're being allocated such a large cost just for upgrades. So by identifying corridors for transmission build out, hopefully that will alleviate some of those costs along with alleviating congestion on the grid. That's another aspect that feeds into this queue logjam. When you have a really congested area, it's going to take more time to study that congestion. SPP, for example, would be studying that through a system impact study. So by alleviating that congestion in a more thorough process, it doesn't get alleviated at a generator interconnection specific process. So currently that's pending, and the comment period ends at the end of this month.
No, that's terrific information for folks to know. Jeff, I'm gonna pick on you for a minute. So those of us in Nebraska, we like to heckle our friends in Texas whenever we can. So but in this case, folks in ERCOT have a pretty good approach to some of their looking at an economic test for their transmission to deal with some of the congestion that's going on in the ERCOT market. ERCOT being the RTO that's primarily Texas. Would you like to talk about that and true costs and how some of that's factored in from a sustainability perspective?
Yeah, and I think ERCOT is, Texas is unique in the sense that it has its own grid. It's the only state that has its own grid. And so it makes it easier in some ways to operate because you're outside of some of the other legal hurdles that you have to go through. So ERCOT can move expeditiously sometimes, doesn't always do that. One of the things that they do when we're looking at transmission projects is decide, very simply, does it pass the economic test? If we were to add the transmission, does it actually deliver savings to ratepayers? And we're seeing in SPP where we work and in ERCOT where we work is this gridlock. The macro trends, one of them is just gridlock and hesitation because technology is changing so quickly. Nobody wants to make a bad bet, particularly on a transmission investment that has a 50-year plus life. But what we're looking at beyond the simple economics of will cheaper power be delivered is something that I think applies throughout our whole region, especially in states that have agriculture, and that is to start looking at when we build wind, when we build solar, when we facilitate the entry of batteries, what other benefits are brought to the system. You know, is it emissions? But really more importantly in states like ours, it's water. You know, how do we make sure that we have the water resources that we need for agriculture? Electricity generation is the second largest use of water in the country behind agriculture, but how do we make sure in a country that's growing that we have the water that we need? In some of our states, we've gone through periods of drought that have been incredibly severe, and we know, because of just the way life is, we will go through more periods of drought that will be severe. So we want we want transmission organizations to start looking at all of those other benefits that come from the use of renewable power, especially the environmental benefits that are more economic, keeping the water available, and so that our communities can continue to operate.
That's great information. And I asked this question because I would like for those of us in the audience who live here in Nebraska to have some exposure to different perspectives and just different ideas of how we are managing this system as we see some of these grid modernization activities going on in the past. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about money and talk about finances. Justin, when you did your introduction, you had mentioned corporate PPAs, whether versus a PPA with a utility or asset ownership by the utilities, some of the different build mechanisms we've seen, that things to get these over the finish line. Could you talk about how you've seen that evolved over the career?
Absolutely. I think historically it's been utility-driven PPAs. And for example, when I got into the industry, 2007, we were talking about $68 power for wind in the Dakotas. Some of the best, you talk about the Saudi Arabia wind. I call North Dakota the Saudi Arabia of wind because I'm from there, but same story, $68 power. And today you might be looking at 25, you know, with the production tax credit, $25 power, $20 power sub. And so it completely changed. We are, as a developer owner, we're having to be creative. How can we be more creative to get projects done? And I think the corporate PPAs really started here. I guess it evolved since 2013, 14, but the trend is corporate PPAs, virtually settled PPAs, and Nebraska is no stranger to this structure. Our last 3 deals were corporate PPAs. You're going to continue to see this. There's so much demand by the consumer today to not only have green energy and less carbon emitting fuels, but green and economically makes sense. So from an economic standpoint, it's hard to not want wind and solar right now from a pure economic standpoint.
I want to kind of pile on to what you've said. Renewable energy, and I'm preaching to the choir in the here because I came and spoke here 6 years ago when it was the wind conference, and now it's the wind and solar conference. But there are not groups that gather like this every year, and Nebraska has been at the forefront of this as an economic development tool, and what Justin's group is doing as an economic development tool. What we're seeing is General Motors, every Suburban that they make, the Tahoe, the Suburban, the Escalade, all of those vehicles, they're coming out every minute they make another one. They're being made, they're transitioning now to be made with 100% wind power. Anheuser-Busch is now committed. All of their beers are being made with wind power. Mars, the candy company, has a wind farm that powers all of their facilities in North America with wind power. And so your beer, your chocolate, your Suburban, it's all guilt-free. Enjoy yourself. The phone. But for a state like Nebraska, and I think one of the trends that we're seeing is that there was a time when there were 3 or 4 states in the country where we got our energy and they shipped it to us. And every state in the country now has the opportunity to be an energy producer and to take on a greater share of their own energy supply with the resources that they have. But a state like Nebraska competing against, your neighbor to the east for data centers and some of the major investments that come, as I see data centers coming to Nebraska, in large part, we saw it in Oklahoma when Google came to Oklahoma because of the wind power. In Texas, Kansas, the same thing. So that corporate demand for, it used to be they wanted to be green, and then they figured out how much savings they could deliver to their stockholders and to get that long-term guaranteed price. And it's a tremendous economic development tool. I know that the Energy Office here has done a great job of recruiting and really promoting that. But that's a tool that Nebraska can use to continue to grow.
Yeah, I would just add one point to that on the what we're calling the virtual PPA. Other circles might call it a synthetic PPA. It's ultimately, as the panelists have mentioned, it's just a financial transaction. So one thing, just a practical tip I would add to watch out for as you're negotiating a virtual PPA or if you're acquiring a virtual PPA, a lot of that at the RTO level is, they're primarily concerned with, at the interconnection phase with the physical interconnection and the physical transaction. So depending on your RTO, you might really not see much regulation of virtual or synthetic PPAs, but just be sure to check the state level for state regulations and any kind of a state statute governing that kind of a financial hedge ultimately.
Yeah. So as Rob alluded to in the initial conversation, if you remember, he had a slide where he talked about the different stages of adoption for electrification, and as some of those things go, and EVs were a part of that, and carbon reduction was a part of that, policy was a part of that. Let's talk about the policy for a minute. What are some of the things, there was a report that came out a few weeks ago that was talking about if we're going to hit the 1.5 centigrade maximum temperature change for climate change, there were a certain amount of things we needed to do, and we actually need to accelerate the decarbonization that we are doing as society. It was pretty telling. Instead of doing it by 2050, we've got to do this by 2030, or once we hit that 2 degree, we're in trouble with a lot of our species. So along those lines, what are some of the, and Sylvia, I'm going to ask you to answer this one first. What are some of the big policy trends that we may see coming out of it? I think we all know from Washington, D.C., we have an administration that has one perspective. There are other members in the Senate who have other perspectives, and politically it's a mess. But at the end of the day, that I'm going to ignore that because I don't want to talk politics, but I do want to talk policy. And what are some of those big policies we see occurring to help or to slow down implementation?
Certainly, and of course there's a lot of rhetoric coming out of the administration, but luckily the market forces are incredibly strong, and primarily what I focus on, FERC is an independent agency, so a lot of FERC's rulemakings and current final rules are somewhat insulated from that, which is, we're very fortunate for that kind of agency structure. One of the things that FERC has done recently in response to an OEA petition, they've revised their interconnection procedures. We've talked a lot about the various log jams in the interconnection queue, and so this was really a response to that. It was a response to delays in the interconnection study process, a lack of transparency in the study process, and also just the overall time required for interconnection. So FERC totally revamped its procedures, and it was to enhance timelines, to provide more clarity and consistency regarding interconnection information. So while that is very much an in-the-weeds policy, it's a policy that gets generation online quicker, and that can absolutely address this undeniable demand for renewable energy yesterday. One other thing that FERC has done recently, they've issued a rule on electric storage participation, and that has directed RTOs to modify their market rules and their model for participation to accommodate storage resources' unique operating characteristics. And RTOs are currently complying with that. They're filing revisions to their tariffs with FERC for approval so that storage resources can participate in organized markets in a similar way to renewable generation. And that in that same rulemaking proceeding, FERC also considered reforms related to distributed energy resource aggregations. That being that when you have distributed energy, you can have an aggregator. Of course, I know several people in the room work on that. And then that aggregation can then bid into a federal market. So the notice of proposed rule considered that kind of participation. It didn't act on it. But the great news there is that's in the public record. That's a part of FERC's existing precedent. It just hasn't created any kind of a binding requirement as far as distributed aggregation. But hopefully it's coming. And then one other point that is that SPP has recently filed with FERC is primary frequency response requirements. So this is something to keep your eye on when you receive an interconnection agreement from SPP, being in Nebraska, or any other RTO. FERC has directed RTOs to include a requirement for generators to be capable of providing primary frequency response. So those will be standard language in your interconnection agreements. Just make sure that you're not taking on any requirements that are above and beyond what other generators are required. It should be standard language, but just keep an eye out for that. And also, there's not a requirement within that to reserve headroom, so you don't have to dedicate capacity to responding to a frequency under or over a frequency event. So the whole point of bringing that up is that FERC is recognizing renewable resources as assumed as a part of the equation, and it's moving forward with them and treating them comparable to other resources. So despite whatever kind of rhetoric we're seeing, that's when it comes down to hardcore regulation. We're, at least at FERC, it's not really resonating there.
Yeah. So one of the other large policies that we see is in the tax space, and I'm going to ask this question, and I am looking at the questions that are coming in. So I've seen this question asked a couple of different times in a couple of different ways. So I'm going to paraphrase this, and I apologize if I don't quite get your question right. What is going to happen when PTCs expire? That's a question I've had several times from the audience, and what does it mean here in Nebraska? Who would like to answer that one first?
I'll take a stab at it. What happens when the PTC goes away? Well, 2021, 80% of the PTC is still applicable. So if you've safe harbored projects, whether you've purchased equipment, whether you purchased blades, turbines, et cetera, that can all apply 80% to 2021. But you take the financeability of projects, the log jam in the queues, you add up opposition and landowner opposition, community opposition, you add up all the permitting issues that occur with projects, you add all that up, and what does that mean? 2021's right around the corner. We have to be making our commitments today for 2021, if it's not known in the room. ITC, is that a jump ball?
Also,
ITC,
yep.
ITC a little bit different. 2019 is going to be the commitment date for folks to make big dollar decisions, such as Geronimo, on procurement of material goods for those type of assets. So 2021, 100% of 30% of the ITC, and it steps down to 26 for 2022 and 22% for 2023. But you also have to safe harbor by sometime next year for the 2021. So it's, the procurement, the big dollar decisions are going to be occurring here in the next next year. So put your thinking hats on.
No, that's a terrific answer. Do you want me to keep going? Go ahead.
Well, I just want to add, part of my, when we talk about the macro, what we're seeing in the macro sense is a lot of technological advancement. We're also seeing a lot of anxiety. So folks who are placing bets today, if I came to you and said, let's build a power plant, we got $100 million to play with, what do you think? Should we do coal? Should we do solar? Should we do wind? Nobody wants, the worst thing is the wrong bet because you're going to own it for 30 years. When the PTC goes away, what I expect will happen is that wind will become one of the only energy resources not subsidized by the federal government. And so the rhetoric, we talk about the rhetoric has to change because we are the group that came and said, look, we'll phase out what we're doing, and we've done that in some of the states. we will become more competitive. We've cut our costs 66% over the last 5 years, and we continue to drive efficiencies in wind and solar and storage. But the political rhetoric in DC is controlled by who has the money. The money right now is the incumbents, and they are going to continue to spend money to make it more and more difficult and more expensive for wind and solar and storage to compete, which means we have to be, what Justin's company is doing is squeezing every cost that we can, and that's what we'll continue to do. But what we have to also do is make sure as that rhetoric heats up that we don't come in and prop up old technologies, because there is a push in Washington right now to take tax dollars and ratepayer fund money and prop up systems that economics have said no longer work. And so as we've been criticized through the years in our infancy, let's not turn around now and start propping up things that, frankly, whose time has passed. Let's move forward. So that's what I expect.
I want to hit on something. You made a comment in what you just said about when this expires, wind will be the only energy production without a federal subsidy. Explain that. Most people probably don't understand the fossil subsidy side.
Right, well, and deliberately so. And I would say, the subsidy discussion is always a touchy one, but, America needs, in order to compete in the world, we need abundant, affordable energy. And from the very beginning, whether it was geological surveys that the federal government undertook or canal building to get the coal to the cities, we have, from the beginning of our country, we have found ways to use our government to make sure that the people in our country have the energy that they need to be successful and our energy can thrive. So it's not a criticism of the way our country gets its energy. There is messaging in that rhetoric, that heated rhetoric, where they say, well, renewables only work with subsidies. Well, our subsidies are the production tax credit is a very obvious, easy to understand incentive that's built into to the tax code. But there are a wide variety of liability protections, of tax treatments, and various things that help every industry compete. And so, as we shift away from the incentive that helped us grow, it's incumbent really on anybody who cares about renewable energy to be able to say, everyone gets a tax support, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but recognize how far renewables have come when our subsidies are phasing out.
And one of my next questions for this group is, what are some of the things, maybe as we're working on these policy actions as an industry, what are some of examples either other states are doing or even other countries are doing that Nebraskans should know about, or examples? Things like how we're dealing with EVs, how we're dealing with electrification, whether we're allowing combustion engines, residential scale solar implementation, community solar in Minnesota. Talk about some of those.
Well, I think one thing, I get a bunch of news feeds that pop up on my email. I'm sure many of you do as well. And if you don't, I'd highly encourage you to, Western Energy Power is one of them. And just looking at the Western markets, and the Western markets, it's an unorganized market, but many of those states are being proactive from an RPS standpoint. So Colorado, Arizona, Hawaii, these are states that if they're California, 100% by 2040, 2050, 2040, anyway, anybody? So these are the RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard. This is, it's driven from the top. It's governors are signing into law, and it's driving more. Nebraska, there's no reason why Nebraska could not take a look at that from a policy standpoint. Minnesota has a renewable portfolio standard, but you are seeing that as a slight trend, I would say, in the overall market where I work in the western part, the western states. I would continue to see that trend occur as renewables they make sense economically, et cetera.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to mention, right in line with that, California, and the bill that they passed, what's interesting about it, it is not just 100% renewables. It has a carbon tie to it. And what that means is the replacement generation, and as the California market electrifies and they have to shift how the production works, it's it's going to be difficult for those quick start recips to actually build in California because of the carbon reduction requirement that is a part of that RPS. So it's not just renewables, it influences battery over recip for how we're going to do that grid balancing and that frequency regulation in those markets. And I don't mean to get all engineering nerdy on you, but that does matter, and that is going to have an impact on the financeability of some of those projects as they go, and how that then migrates into Colorado, how that migrates into Texas, some of the states that we work with and that influence how we react within the SPP, Minnesota, Illinois. Illinois is a terrific example of a state which is doing a tremendous amount with grid modernization, distributed generation, and renewables, and getting to those carbon numbers, and they're very quiet about it, but they're a terrific example to look at. Again, a very high percentage of ag in that state as well. So.
To your point about what trends are we seeing, certainly at the RTO level across the country, we're seeing streamlined agreements, streamlined processes, and that is also being picked up in a lot of states. Certainly we see that when it comes to registering your resource as a certified renewable resource or registering your resource as a REC generator. In Nebraska, there's a streamlined process that is specifically made for privately developed renewable generation. It's required by Nebraska statute, and I've just got the form right here. It's a 1-page, 2-page PDF. You have to meet several pre-construction requirements, but it's a form. It's very streamlined. So we're definitely seeing that at the state level as well. And even at the municipal level, I think there's definitely room for improvement at the hyperlocal level, such as at the county and municipal level. But it's not far-fetched to think that there's far more potential for that kind of streamlining.
I think one of the other trends is, I'm thinking of my grandparents. There's always somebody who's got a fax machine. I mean, anybody still have a fax machine? The fax machine, the landline phone, the remote for the VCR that has a cable between or a VCR.
Where are you going with this, Jeff?
Yeah, there are states. Nebraska is not one of them. There are states and there's some of the states I work in, the politics are tough. The politics are painful. They can hold out, they can keep the VCR as long as possible. The reality is policies out of states like California. The United States is the world's largest energy consumer, greatest country in the world. We're 5% of the population of the planet. So policies, when China starts adopting policies around electric vehicles, and car manufacturers start changing their manufacturing to meet the demand of that market. When Europe starts making changes, and Rob alluded to that earlier, that as other countries start making changes and consumers start adopting products, we'll have states that are leaders on policy, but the reality is we'll all be pulled along because the economics, every iteration of these technologies moves it forward, makes it cheaper. The future is, it's cleaner, cheaper, made in Nebraska. And so there are states that are going to lead, there are states that are not going to lead, but everyone's going to get pulled along by these policies because it's going to push us.
One thing to add, Gretchen, is Minnesota has a 1.5% carve-out for solar. So that's another just aspect of the renewable carve-out that you might see in some states. I think it's really accelerated the development and deployment of solar energy from a DG, distributed generation, community solar, but also large-scale utility perspective. I think Minnesota is a great template to look at from a policy standpoint for solar energy specifically.
I would just add one point. A really great way to see what's market as far as various state requirements and RPS policies go is a website, Desire, D-S-I-R-E. And they've just very user-friendly, and it's a great way to compare side to side, state by state.
Yeah, it is. It's a terrific for general public utilities for everyone to be using. If you haven't noticed, we kind of have a set of questions here that we're trying to run through. I'm going to deviate from the script, and I'm telling you that so that I can give them a heads up that I'm giving them a curveball. And I'm going to try to combine a couple more of your questions again. I would like you guys to talk about, if you would, two things: repowering and decommissioning. What we're doing, when do we do both? What do we do with the materials we decommission? And how is the process coming along? Are we just decommissioning more facilities, or are we repowering? So, anybody?
Well, I'll speak from a policy perspective, and I think Justin can speak from a developer's perspective. What we're seeing in the states that we cover is very few decommissionings. Much more often, and that technological advancement, that cost reduction, that it's in some cases, even after 8 to 10, 12 years, it's advantageous to come in and replace what was state of the art a decade earlier, and put either new generator, new gearbox, new blades, upgrading that equipment to get more electricity out of the same wind. And so we're seeing a lot of that. On the decommissioning front, on the policy side, what we're doing is, and I would say to anyone who's a landowner, you know this already, but part of what developers do with landowners at the outset is to make sure we have in place an agreed procedure so that and we know and everybody has a solid understanding of what happens at the end of a project's life. And we're working with regulators and state lawmakers to make sure that we have solid policies that make sure that when a project does come to an end, that we restore that land to the way it was when we got there. So that's what we see on the policy front. But so far, it's all about just keeping on and getting as much energy out of that air as possible.
Gretchen, on the repowering aspect, who would have thought that we'd be sitting here 2018 and talking about repowering? But the industry is actually approaching 20 years of a lot of renewable wind development around the country, especially in California, states like California. So Geronimo, we have a set-aside commercial team that's only looking at what projects we can maybe buy into or acquire to repower. These are projects that have proven permitting, proven landowner agreements, proven infrastructure. So it might be a matter of fact of putting some more steel in the ground and upgrading the nacelle, but a lot of the necessities of a good project are already there. A lot of the ingredients are there. So it's something that Geronimo and our firm is looking at from a global level and from a nationwide level at least, and looking at intently.
To the point about once a facility is getting ready to be decommissioned, a lot of times way before decommissioning happens at the pre-project construction stage, as a part of getting your permit from the state to operate, they'll require a letter of credit for decommissioning. So a lot of that, the funding for decommissioning is already in that letter of credit, which is usually made out to the state. So a lot of regulators are really thinking ahead in that way. As to the point about repowering, a lot of times I'm currently working on a repowering deal, and you see that in one owner is wanting to dispose of a facility, another potential owner is going to be acquiring it to repower it. In this particular deal, we're seeing it because the facility's just several turbines just aren't operating. And so that repowering is going to be reflected in your purchase price. And also when you're doing due diligence on those kinds of deals, you know what you're getting into for the most part. You know that, you're not, the representations as to operations, a lot of them, the owner's just not going to be able to make a lot of representations. So that's how it certainly will manifest in a deal. And it's a great way to acquire facilities for a lower cost, knowing that you're going to have to make some repairs.
Sure. And I did neglect to talk for the audience. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, repowering, what it is you have an existing facility and you are going to change the equipment at that facility in some way, shape, or form. It may be as simple as changing the blades and using a different blade. It may be removing the blades and the nacelle or the top of the system, the mechanical part of the tower, and replacing that with a larger or different unit. And it may be removing it all the way down to the base and simply reusing the foundation. There are different levels of repowering that is going on nationwide. From the engineering side, what I'll tell you is we do a lot of the studies for at what level can it be done, at what level is it safe to do, can they get the 20-year life, what's the cost balance, those types of life cycle cost analysis. Just as you do them on a new facility, you'll do them on an old facility, and then we'll even see that balanced against, do we want to look at a new facility on a 100-meter tower compared to a repowering where we may just replace the nacelle. What provides the best margin of return for these guys? So that's the type of work that is going on in the industry right now in repowering on the technical side of things. So
Gretchen, just to add one point, again, going back to when 2007, the average megawatt size for a turbine was 1.5 megawatts. Today, the industry norm is like that 3 to 4 megawatt regime. So what does that mean? Less impact on the ground for ranchers and farmers out there. Much less impact, and getting the same output, 200 megawatt, or if it's a 200 megawatt project, but much less impact to get the same bang for your buck. I don't know if it equals dollar to dollar, but a lot less impact on the ground.
we have about 10 minutes before a break, and so I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and kind of go, if you guys are okay with it, I'm gonna skip through some of the things we're gonna talk about on the regulatory side and talk a little bit more about electrification. Is that okay? Okay. So in that space, again, we heard Rob talk about electrification, and it's really being driven by the shift of society, right? It's the Amazon society, it's the autonomous vehicle, it's electrification of the transit system in larger communities, needing ways to charge buses when they stop to pick their passengers up. What does that mean for us here in Nebraska, and what does that mean for the renewable industry? With some of those impacts, not all of those impacts are going to be on the utilities themselves. The utilities are going to bear a big chunk of the burden for this, given our public power state. But how will stakeholder engagement, what the stakeholder demand is, what the stakeholder is willing to pay, how they're going to demand their facilities change, not only with the utility, but also with the cities and transit and public services. Justin, do you want to talk a little bit about stakeholder engagement and how that influences renewables as a piece of this electrification market? I'm putting you on the spot, I know.
It's an easy one. I have to think about this one a little bit, Gretchen.
Okay, you think about it, and I'm going to ask Sylvia a different question. Sylvia, could you talk a little bit about let's talk heat pumps, and let's take another one of those. You remember the chart that Rob had up there, and it was that big yellow bar with all of the electrification and those EVs, and then you saw that peak, that winter peak that showed up, right, from the heat pumps. Well, think about Nebraska. Think about how many of us use gas to heat our homes, and as we transition those homes from gas heat to electric, we can imagine that peak, and it ties well with our wind. Sylvia and Justin, feel free to answer this one too. How does that roll out? How is that going to kind of impact our system?
So of course, there can be usually it comes in the context of an energy efficiency requirement, and the rollout is, at least in what I'm familiar with, there's been about 2 different ways. One is just a blanket, we need more efficient technology, utility, do it. The other way is to do so in a more targeted, strategic way where you're only installing the more efficient technology, such as heat pumps, at certain areas within the service territory or to certain customers. So it's the latter has the ability to shave peak and to fill in some of the valleys there. But to your the prior question about what are the kind of the changing landscape and what does that mean for utilities or ratepayers, I think what we're really going to be seeing is utilities expanding into areas that are not their traditional business model, that aren't their traditional area of work. The most adjacent area is transportation. We're seeing that certainly with electrification. So I think that's going to be really interesting to watch what other areas that are adjacent to the utility space or the developer space that now all of a sudden, because of increased electrification, the business model kind of subsumes and expands into that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And how are we as individual groups going to help work with the utilities so that it's a win-win scenario, right? This is a public power state, and that is not going to change, and they do a good job of keeping our rates down. How do we work with them to move that forward too? And I interrupted you, sorry.
No, that's good. I think what we're doing right here today is a good start. This is a good start. Education is another big part of it. Working with our public power districts is key. It's folks like you all going back and advocating for what we're talking about today. So in relation to the heat pumps and cold climate heat pumps and EV, You know, a stat that I just heard the other day was in CAISO, California ISO, they're going to see a 50% jump in load as it relates to both of those pieces. So both the EV car vehicles and heat pumps, 50% jump in load as it relates to it. So we're going to see an intensive amount of, and now being able to control that, like what Rob was talking about earlier, is going to be so key. Yeah. Being able to take advantage of the leveling off of when consumers are utilizing it, and being able to for it to be smart and in the grid. So.
That's perfect. I love it.
Yeah, I think the part of it's education, you know, what Justin says, part of it's what we're doing here. I'm thinking about my grandparents who didn't get to do this, but when the LED bulbs came out, do you remember the news stories where people are like, you know, you can have my light bulbs when you take them from my cold dead hands, you know, that there was this, you know, but I was shocked this morning to hear that 75% of our lighting load has been reduced thanks to LED bulbs. I've done LED because LEDs are cheap now. It took a little bit of time to get there, but you would have thought people were going to march on Washington to keep the light bulb. And, but that adoption, the Nest thermostats, you know, I'm not going to let the government tell me when I can run my thermostat. Yet I get an alert almost every afternoon in the summer telling me that they're going to cycle my thermostat. It's saving me money. It's saving them money. It's one of those things that over time we begin electric vehicles. You know, the concept, I don't want to have range anxiety about if I want to drive to Minnesota next weekend, by God, I should have a right to do that. But once you drive the electric vehicle and you find out that it performs better and it's cheaper to maintain and it's, has features and so consumers will slowly push this forward. I think that's how we make it happen, is just encouraging people to be early adopters, prove the technology, show the benefits, and our utilities, frankly, it's in their business interest to, continue expanding the use of electricity and the electrification of America, because as we become more efficient, we lose demand, we lose load. It's that electrification that really is going to save their business model. And so I think it's really just a matter of continuing to counter some of the negative. We're seeing it in electric vehicles right now. The paid opposition to come in and attack electric vehicles. We need to be voices out there saying, hey, what you're hearing about EVs is not true, and just continue to push forward.
So as my mother would say, we're going to eat this bear one bite at a time with facts. Hey, would you please join me in thanking these panelists?